It was a crisp autumn morning when Max, a spirited golden retriever, bounded through the dense woods near his home in the small town of Willow Creek. His owner, Tom Harrison, a retired history teacher, followed at a leisurely pace, enjoying the tranquility of the forest. The leaves crunched underfoot, and the air was filled with the earthy scent of fallen foliage. Max, however, was on a mission. His nose was to the ground, sniffing out every hidden treasure the woods had to offer. Tom had adopted Max 5 years ago from a local shelter, and the two had become inseparable. Max was more than just a pet. He was Tom's companion, his confidant, and his reason to get out of the house every day. The woods were their sanctuary, a place where they could escape the mundanity of everyday life and lose themselves in nature. As Tom walked, he noticed Max digging furiously at the base of an old oak tree. This wasn't unusual. Max often unearthed sticks, rocks, and the occasional bone. But this time there was something different about the way Max was behaving. His tail was wagging furiously and he was emitting a series of excited barks. "Max, what have you got there, boy?" Tom called out, quickening his pace. As he approached, he saw that Max had dug up an old weathered shoe. It was caked in mud and looked like it had been buried for years. Tom knelt down to get a closer look. The shoe was a man's dress shoe, the kind that might have been worn in the 1950s or 60s. It was in surprisingly good condition, considering how long it must have been buried. "Good find, Max," Tom said, patting the dog on the head. "But I don't think it's going to fit you." Max barked in response, as if to say, "Keep looking." Tom picked up the shoe and examined it more closely. There was something odd about it. The leather was cracked and worn, but the sole was intact and there was something inside the shoe, a small folded piece of paper. Tom's heart skipped a beat. He carefully extracted the paper and unfolded it. It was a faded photograph of a young couple smiling and holding hands. On the back of the photo, written in elegant cursive, were the words, "Forever yours, 1962. Tom's mind raced. Who were these people? Why had the shoe been buried in the woods? And why had Max been so determined to find it? "Come on, Max," Tom said, standing up. "Let's take this home and see what we can find out." Chapter 2. The investigation begins back at his modest home on the edge of town. Tom spread the contents of his find on the kitchen table. The shoe, the photograph, and the note were all laid out before him. Max sat at his feet, watching intently as Tom began his investigation. Tom's first thought was to take the items to the local historical society. Willow Creek was a small town with a rich history, and if anyone could help him identify the couple in the photo, it would be the folks at the Historical Society. The next morning, Tom and Max made their way to the Willow Creek Historical Society, located in a charming old building on Main Street. The society was run by a group of dedicated volunteers, most of whom were retirees with a passion for local history. Tom was greeted by Mrs. Eleanor Whitaker, the society's president. She was a sprightly woman in her late 70s, with a keen eye for detail and an encyclopedic knowledge of the town's history. "Tom, what brings you here today?" Mrs. Whitaker asked, her eyes twinkling with curiosity. Tom explained his discovery and showed her the shoe, the photograph, and the note. Mrs. Whitaker's eyes widened as she examined the items. "This is fascinating," she said. "Let me see if I can find anything in our archives." She led Tom to a room filled with old photographs, documents, and artifacts. They spent the next few hours poring over the materials, searching for any clue that might lead them to the identity of the couple in the photo. Finally, Mrs. Whitaker found a photograph that matched the one Tom had discovered. It was a picture of a young couple, taken at the Willow Creek High School prom in 1962. The caption beneath the photo read, "James and Margaret Thompson, Prom King and Queen, 1962. "James and Margaret Thompson," Tom repeated. "Do you know what happened?" "Totham." Mrs. Whitaker's expression grew somber. "I remember the Thompsons," she said. "They were a lovely couple. James was a war hero, and Margaret was a teacher at the elementary school, but they disappeared under mysterious circumstances in 1965. Noon ever found out what happened to them." Tom's heart sank. "Disappeared? What do you mean?" Mrs. Whittaker sighed. "It was a big scandal at the time. James and Margaret were last seen leaving a town hall meeting. Their car was found abandoned on the side of the road, but there was no sign of them. The police conducted an extensive search, but they were never found. It was as if they had vanished into thin air." Tom felt a chill run down his spine. "And no one ever found out what happened to them?" Mrs. Whittaker shook her head. "No, it's one of the town's greatest mysteries." Tom thanked Mrs. Whittaker for her help and left the Historical Society with a heavy heart. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled upon something significant. The shoe, the photograph, and the note were all pieces of a puzzle that had remained unsolved for over 50 years. Chapter 3. The cold case, determined to uncover the truth, Tom decided to take his findings to the local police. He knew that the disappearance of James and Margaret Thompson was a cold case, but he hoped that new evidence might prompt the police to reopen the investigation. The Willow Creek Police Department was a small, unassuming building located on the outskirts of town. Tom and Max were greeted by Officer Linda Martinez, a young and enthusiastic detective who had recently joined the force. "Tom, what can I do for you today?" Officer Martinez asked, smiling as she petted Max. Tom explained his discovery and showed her the shoe, the photograph, and the note. Officer Martinez listened intently, her expression growing more serious as Tom recounted the story of James and Margaret Thompson's disappearance. "This is incredible," she said. "We've had cold cases before, but nothing like this. Let me take these items and see if we can get any new leads." Tom handed over the evidence, feeling a mix of hope and apprehension. He knew that the chances of solving a 50-year-old mystery were slim, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the verge of uncovering something important. Over the next few weeks, Officer Martinez and her team worked tirelessly to analyze the evidence. They dusted the shoe for fingerprints, examined the photograph for any hidden clues, and even sent the note to a handwriting expert. But despite their best efforts, they were unable to find any new leads. Just when it seemed like the case had hit a dead end, Officer Martinez received a call from the state crime lab. They had found something unusual on the shoe, a trace of blood that had been preserved in the leather. The blood was old, but it was still viable for DNA testing. Officer Martinez immediately sent the sample for analysis. The results came back a few weeks later, and they were shocking. The blood on the shoe matched the DNA of James Thompson. "This changes everything," Officer Martinez said, her voice filled with excitement. "We now have evidence that James Thompson was injured, possibly killed, and his shoe was buried in the woods. This could be the break we need to solve this case." Tom felt a surge of hope. "What happens now?" Officer Martinez smiled. "Now, we reopen the case and start digging deeper. We'll need to interview anyone who might have known James and Margaret, and we'll need to search the woods for more evidence. This is just the beginning, Tom. We're going to find out what happened to the Thompsons." Chapter 4. The search for answers. With the case officially reopened, Tom and Officer Martinez began their search for answers. They started by interviewing anyone who had known James and Margaret Thompson. Most of the people who had been close to the couple had since passed away, but there were a few who still remembered them. One of those people was Mrs. Edith Collins, an elderly woman who had been friends with Margaret Thompson. Mrs. Collins lived in a small cottage on the edge of town, and she welcomed Tom and Officer Martinez with open arms. "I remember James and Margaret well," Mrs. Collins said, her voice trembling with emotion. "They were such a lovely couple, James was a war hero and Margaret was the sweetest woman you could ever meet. It broke my heart when they disappeared. Tom showed Mrs. Collins the photograph and the note. She studied them carefully, here ye's filling with tears. "This is definitely James and Margaret," she said. "I remember that night. It was their prom, and they were so happy. But after they disappeared, everything changed. The-town was never the same." Officer Martinez asked Mrs. Collins if she knew of anyone who might have wanted to harm James and Margaret. Mrs. Collins hesitated for a moment before answering. "There was one man," she said. "His name was Walter Grayson. He was a wealthy businessman, and he had a reputation for being ruthless. He and James had a falling out over a business deal, and Walter threatened James. I always wondered if he had something to do with their disappearance." Tom and Officer Martinez exchanged a glance. This was the first real lead they had. They thanked Mrs. Collins for her help and left her cottage with a renewed sense of purpose. Their next stop was the local library, where they hoped to find more information about Walter Grayson. The librarian, a young woman named Sarah, was eager to help. Walter Grayson was a prominent figure in Willow Creek, Sarah said as she pulled out old newspapers and documents. He owned several businesses in town, and he was known for his ruthless business practices. But he was also a philanthropist, and he donated a lot of money to the town. Tom and Officer Martinez spent hours poring over the documents, searching for any mention of Walter Grayson and his connection to James Thompson. Finally, they found an article from 1964 that mentioned a lawsuit between James Thompson and Walter Grayson. The lawsuit was over a failed business deal, and it had been settled out of court. "This could be our smoking gun," Officer Martinez said. "If Walter Grayson had a motive to harm James Thompson, we need to find out more about him." Chapter 5. The Confession. With the new lead, Officer Martinez decided to pay a visit to Walter Grayson. He was now an old man, living in a luxurious retirement home on the outskirts of town. When Officer Martinez and Tom arrived, they were greeted by a nurse who led them to Grayson's room. Walter Grayson was sitting in a wheelchair by the window, staring out at the garden. He looked frail and weak, but his eyes were sharp and alert. "Grayson, my name is Officer Linda Martinez, and this is Tom Harrison," Officer Martinez said. "We're here to ask you some questions about James and Margaret Thompson." Grayson's expression darkened at the mention of the Thompsons. "What do you want to know?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "We have reason to believe that you may have been involved in their disappearance," Officer Martinez said. "Can you tell us what happened?" Grayson was silent for a long time, his eyes fixed on the garden. Finally, he spoke. "It was a long time ago," he said. "I was a different man then. I was ruthless, driven by greed and ambition. James Thompson was a good man, but he stood in my way. We had a business deal that went sour, and I blamed him for it. I threatened him, but it never meant for anything to happen to him or Margaret." Officer Martinez leaned forward. "What did happen, Mr. Grayson?" Grayson sighed. "I hired someone to scare James, to make him back off, but things got out of hand. There was an argument and James was killed. Margaret saw everything, and she threatened to go to the police. I couldn't let that happen, so I had her silenced too." Tom felt a wave of anger and sadness wash over him. "You killed them?" he asked, his voice trembling. Grayson nodded. "I buried them in the woods near the old oak tree. I thought no one would ever find them, but I was wrong." Officer Martinez stood up. "Mr. Grayson, you're under arrest for the murder of James and Margaret Thompson. You have the right to remain silent." As Officer Martinez read Grayson his rights, Tom felt a sense of closure. The mystery of James and Margaret Thompson's disappearance had finally been solved, thanks to Max's keen sense of smell and a little bit of luck. Chapter 6, Closure. The news of Walter Grayson's confession spread quickly through Willow Creek. The town was in shock, but there was also a sense of relief. After more than 50 years, the mystery of James and Margaret Thompson's disappearance had finally been solved. A memorial service was held for the Thompsons, and the entire town turned out to pay their respects. Tom and Max were there, standing quietly, at the back of the crowd. As the service ended, Tom felt a sense of peace. He had played a small part in bringing closure to a long-standing mystery, and he knew that James and Margaret could finally rest in peace. As they walked home, Tom looked down at Max and smiled. "You did good, boy," he said, ruffling the dog's fur. "You did real good." Max wagged his tail, as if to say, "I know." And with that, the two of them walked off into the sunset, ready for their next adventure. Epilogue, the legacy in the months that followed. The story of James and Margaret Thompson became a part of Willow Creek's history. A plaque was erected in their memory, and the town came together to honor their legacy. Tom and Max continued their daily walks in the woods, but now there was a new sense of purpose to their outings. They were no longer just exploring. They were keeping an eye out for any other mysteries that might be waiting to be uncovered. As for Walter Grayson, he was sentenced to life in prison for the murders of James and Margaret Thompson. He spent his final days in a prison cell, haunted by the memories of his past. And so, the story of the shoe in the woods came to an end. But for Tom and Max, it was just the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. A chapter filled with adventure, discovery, and the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog.